almighty cloud. I believe it's recording. Does it say it's recording on your side?
Yes, it's informed me.
All right. Welcome, everybody, to this special emergency session of the Space-Time Mind broadcast. Robots are taking over the world or something, and I haven't really kept up with the literature on this stuff. Like I thought I was pretty slick back in the 90s as a philosophy grad student who also knew a little bit about neural networks. But, you know, you have some kids, you get promoted to full professor. Next thing you know, there's like a whole massive sub industry that I know jack shit about.
Well,
I do know Alex Kiefer, so you're the expert. Tell us about what the fuck is going on with LaMDA. That's the one that's been in the news big time recently because some Google dude maybe got laid off for saying LaMDA had sentience or some shit. Anyway, what are these things?
Well,
what's your hot takes?
My hot take is that all that stuff from the 90s was just right. So you actually know everything. It's just like minor variations. But that's probably not a very popular position. Yeah, I think the guy got he's on like unpaid leave or something. I haven't followed up on what's happened with that story, but yeah. So I just think I think that so I got embroiled in a minor discussion debate on Twitter over this, and what wrote me in was that everyone was like certain that this thing couldn't be conscious, right? This right. Trillion parameter language model.
And we're talking specifically about LaMDA, right?
Yes. Yeah. And it's not that I think that LaMDA necessarily is conscious, although I feel a little bad saying that. So it's like, it's not like the days of yore where it was just like, well, obviously that thing is just 100 lines of code or whatever.
Right.
I mean, LaMDA could be fewer lines of code than that, but anyway, I think that the quality of the arguments for the sort of negative position just seemed really kind of shitty to me. So that's what pulled me in.
Can we?
But
oh yeah, go ahead.
Yeah. No, I mean, there's so much to talk about here. Like we could talk about I mean, obviously, of course, things have happened since the 90s. Sure, okay. But I think it's basically just connectionism with fancy architectures and maybe slightly different learning objectives, in terms of what produces these amazing results that are getting people to think that something might be sentient,
I wonder if you would be willing to do a little LaMDA for dummies, maybe a little, like spend like 5 minutes or so to just say like, because I think people read about this, like lay persons read about some of this stuff in the popular press, and they really don't know anything about like what the architecture is or what the training data are. And so I wonder if we could just spend a little bit of time talking about for dummies fashion. Like, so what is LaMDA? What is LaMDA? What are the inputs to LaMDA?
Yeah, sure. I mean, so with the caveat that I actually don't know that much about LaMDA specifically, because I mean, as far as I know, this isn't it's not like an open source project, or if it is, then I haven't looked at it. But I know the kinds of models that Google's using for this stuff. So we can, like, I mean, I guess the really for dummies version is it's a neural network. Well, that's not right. That's not really for dummies.
That's dumb enough.
If you know what
for space-time mind dummies know what a neural network is.
Right. Yeah. So my bet was like, I bet $100. That seems crazy. I bet maybe $100 that LaMDA is some form of transformer or some other large giant over parameterized neural net. So like basically, okay, so first of all, inputs, it's trained on a corpus of 1 billion sentences, Wikipedia, whatever. And again, I'm speaking in general about big language models here, like state-of-the-art kind of big language models, but LaMDA is definitely some form of that, right? And so, you train, we can get into specifics, but you train like I think of this as an unsupervised learning objective. So if you're big into this connectionist stuff, right? As you said.
Yeah, 90s. I got the
Yeah,
here to represent the 90s.
But so unsupervised learning was so popular in the 90s, or at least that's when a lot of the cool like landmark papers came out, like the wake sleep algorithm stuff. So like, this idea that you can use the sensory signal itself to train the network, it's like super exciting, right? But the thing that took off and transformed connectionism into deep learning was supervised learning via backpropagation from like a target, which, a lot of philosophers, I remember I got into this stuff in graduate school, but all the philosophers were saying, oh, this is nothing. They can't do variable binding. It's unrealistic anyway, the way it learns, because you're taking sort of a teacher signal and fitting your model directly to the teacher signal. But the idea that you can just pick up on this structure, the nested statistical structure of the relationships between the inputs, if you have a big sensory input channel, like an image or something, is what was exciting to me about unsupervised learning. And so the case of language is interesting, right? Because language isn't exactly like images, but anyway, stop me if this is like too going into the weeds.
Let me ask you some baby questions.
Oh, okay, sure.
Just so people get a handle on stuff like the difference between supervised and unsupervised learning, and to kind of also lay the groundwork for what's potentially cool about LaMDA and some of these other things. So like back old school connectionism, especially for philosophy people that maybe have picked up some of this stuff by reading like Paul or Pat Churchland papers. Again, this is the 90s or, even earlier. This is like Stranger Things for philosophy. So we're going back to the 80s, 90s. You got like a feed forward 3-layer connectionist network, and you're training it to, for example, sort images into like male human faces versus female human faces. And the output units are something like one is labeled male and the other one is labeled female. And then the input units are like this array, this artificial retinal array of something like pixels from the images. And everything is connected to everything else in this feed forward sort of way. And the human beings that have set this all up, they know or have decided which of those images count as male faces and which of those have counted as female faces. And then the application of like, say, the learning algorithm, maybe it's back propagation, is going to involve some kind of measurement of how close to the right answer they got, right? So you show it a face and it says either the right answer or the wrong answer, depending on whether it was right or wrong. That will influence the way in which the weights get adjusted.
Right.
And now that would be supervised, right? Or unsupervised?
That's supervised, yeah.
And supervised, and what makes it supervised is like that the researchers already know what the right answer is. And in some sense, there's a causal influence from the researchers who know to the ultimate output of the model.
Right.
Where something like unsupervised learning would be like, you're not telling in any way what the right answer is or indicating what the desired outcome is or something like that. So you got like the one example that comes to my mind of this stuff is you just have some kind of like annealing process, and then next thing you know, you have like the analog of cortical columns. Right. And you weren't looking for cortical columns. You weren't rewarding it for getting. It's just like this weird fucking emergent or outcome. That's the way that things settle down. Yeah. And so like now with these, would you call them big language?
Yeah.
Was that the phrase you used? Giant language models.
Yeah.
So the inputs, instead of a bunch of pictures of faces, the inputs are coming from a corpus of linguistic data, right? Like you said, was it literally Wikipedia? Just like here, you stupid network, go read Wikipedia.
Right.
And then what are the outputs?
Yeah. So you set things up beautifully, Matt. If I can, so you have a feed-forward network in the supervised learning case. It's just like let's say it's an image, just to go back to images for a second, and then 3 layers, and then an output. So unsupervised learning, it's really not that deep a distinction, right? So yeah, you can say unsupervised learning means there's no input from a teacher. I mean, it's a bit of a straw man, right? But really what unsupervised learning is you just sort of twist that around on itself and make the input the output, right? So I think the classic example is the Helmholtz machine. If I were doing this live, I would like throw up a paper title now, but you'll do your space-time mind magic, but editing to this later. But anyway, so the Helmholtz machine takes images as input. It's got, let's say, three layers of nodes. And so let's say you want to classify the digits 0 through 9. So on the top layer, you just give it a little bit of help by setting it up so that there are 10 nodes in the top layer, right? And then there's various versions of this, but basically—
The top layer, you mean the output layer?
Well, it's not really the output layer anymore, right? So you've got— so let's just take the visual of a 3-layer neural network, right? Input is images, some hidden layer, and then what normally would have been the output layer. So in this case, you just feed the thing an image, propagate a signal up to the top layer, which has 10 nodes in it, and then propagate, usually through a different set of weights, propagate a signal back down to the image and measure the difference between the reconstruction and the image.
Okay.
So it's a lot like supervised learning, right? You are telling the network in virtue of its architecture and loss function, like sort of what it should learn. It should learn to reconstruct the inputs. But if it does this well, and if you're kind of lucky and right, if the gradient descent goes well, then you'll end up with 10 nodes at the top layer that represent each of the digits in terms of their functional role, right? Because if you feed the thing a picture of a 1, again, this is not like by any means a guaranteed outcome, but if you train it successfully, then one of those top level nodes will end up representing a 1, just because it was forced to compress the information into that top layer, right? And we know there are 10 classes and there are 10 nodes, so.
Okay, so let me just make sure I'm getting the gist of this. So suppose I have a whole bunch of different photographs of numerals, single digit numerals.
Yeah.
And these can be all sorts of different fonts, photographs with a wide variety of lighting conditions, right? So maybe you just go around, you photograph people's addresses, and people have all sorts of different carvings and or children drawing numbers with crayons, all sorts of different, like a wide variety of images. Now, human beings, we could look at these images, and despite all the differences, we could sort them into 10 piles, 0, 1, 2, up through 9. And so we could see all these similarities despite these differences. But it is like, when you start thinking about how that's done, it's probably something kind of complicated. It's really hard. You think about like the numeral 4, there's lots of different ways to make a numeral 4. You could have it open at the top, or you could have it connected you could have the pointy top 4 and the open 4. You could have sans serif and serif versions of both of those. You could have a blue one, and you could have a white one. You could have one that's partially occluded by a bird that happened to be flying by. So you got all these different photographs, and in some sense, you're telling the network, okay, motherfucker, sort these. And you don't tell it, by the way, you only have 10 nodes. It just happens to have
those
10 nodes. And then by what of course isn't a miracle, but might seem a little miraculous, it settles into this configuration whereby these thousands of images naturally seemed then to be in these 10 distinct piles.
Right. And there's all sorts of ways to make it seem less magical. Like, you can talk about sort of heavy in learning at the synapse level in these networks that sort of carves channels for the input the signals to propagate such that this happens. But yeah, I mean, I think that it is important to point out that, yeah, just like seeing numbers is not a trivial thing. Like, I guess we've had OCR for a long time, but it wasn't that great.
It's hard, if you've ever like sat down and tried to do some baby version of the programming. Like if you were to try to explicitly program a computer to identify from 2-dimensional visual inputs when it's looking at the number 4 or not, right? you just think of like this huge list of if then statements. So if there's a pixel here, 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 but not here, but not here, that counts as 4. Right? Like if you try to just brute force this, you would have this huge program. You could make up a lookup table, but it would involve a lot of work on your part as the human being. You'd have to know all the right answers ahead of time, and then all possible right answers, and then somehow put like explicitly build that structure into your machine. But what's great about these things is that the structure somehow lives in the data. We're not sure how it lives in the data, and this awesome machine is able to extract the structure from the data, and oftentimes we're not sure how it did it. There's like back in the 80s, 90s, there was this fun example of it was, I think, a perceptron that was identifying tanks in a military sense of the word tank as like a heavy armored vehicle. There was a video camera system that was able to identify the presence of tanks in, oftentimes these scenes where there's lots of trees and the tank is partially occluded by a building or something like that. There might be things in the scenes that you might mistake for a tank. And it was able to extract tanks based on features that the researchers weren't quite sure what the features were like. And you might think, if you could kind of like do a rational reconstruction of this. You look at all these scenes, you might be like, what actually this thing is doing is not so much detecting tanks, but it's detecting corners. It's detecting things like T junctions, right? There's certain kinds of intersections you get in photographs of machines and other there's all these right angles and stuff like that, where in nature, photographs of trees and plants like that, you're not going to see as many T intersections. Or I'm sure I'm bungling the example, but that's the gist of it. Like there's structure. The humans may not even know which structures are the ones that are doing the lifting or the doing the heavy work here. So now can we try to translate this into language corpi and big language models? So with something like LaMDA, you've got a bunch of Wikipedia articles. There's structure in there implicitly, right? Like without telling the machine, for example, the difference between a noun and a verb. There's just enough structure in the language that information can reassert itself without anybody explicitly telling it, like, okay, by the way, these words are nouns, and sometimes they work as adverbs, and when they're in this part of the sentence, they're more likely to be the grammatical subject, but when they're more towards the end, they're more like, you don't have to tell it any of that. The truth is out there in the language itself. It has enough structure so that you train it on that, and then it could spit it back at you right. You could say like, okay, right, like come up with a parody of Welcome to the Jungle by Guns N' Roses that seems like it was written by Oliver Wilde, or Oscar Wilde. Although Oliver Wilde, I'd be interested in that one too. Welcome to the Jungle by Guns N' Roses reinterpreted by Oscar Wilde. And then it comes up with this thing. It's just like, oh, that's really, you read the output and you're like, that's really very clever. I wouldn't even know how to explain to somebody what would make something simultaneously appear like it came from Oscar Wilde and it came from Axl Rose and Slash and Duff McKagan. I wouldn't know how to explain that, but I could recognize that it fucking nailed it.
Yeah.
And so how am I doing so far with
great. I mean,
say think false.
I know I had like 3 branches off of every sentence that I want to explore, but like basically I think that's I was going to point out one thing. So I think that there was a big thing that happened. I don't know exactly where the roots of this begin, but like, I don't know, 2011 or so, or 12, like so you can imagine how this sort of would work with images, right? Because you can you can sort of like, there would be correlations between pixels, right? So there's this big multi-dimensional high information content signal, which is the image stream, right? But for language, you've just got these like words, which, of course you could start with images of words, but that's right. That's making it needlessly complicated. So you've got like a discrete vocabulary of however many words, and you have to figure out how can we apply the same kinds of algorithms to language as to words, and the answer is a language embedding. So basically, through training this a network on this giant linguistic corpus, you can derive a representation for each word or each character or each sentence, whatever level you're running the thing on. That's basically just like a big vector, right? Because when you convert into math, into code, it's an image is just a big vector of numbers. So you just learn a language vector by doing unsupervised learning, so that like you scan like a small sliding window over the corpus, right? So you're reading a sentence, essentially taking in 5 words at once, and you learn the language the word embedding, so that it gets to be good at predicting words around it, which is a simple, right, unsupervised. It's some people might call it supervised learning, but you see why I'd call it unsupervised. It's basically taking the input and using it to reconstruct a different part of the input, or like a
so it's about like a word adjacency, or like frequency of
exactly.
And is it and then you could one thing you could do is define a neighborhood for a word. So like what's the next word, either one ahead or one behind, and or what is couldn't you also give a neighborhood definition where it's like 2 words away, 3 words away, right?
Yeah, that's a free parameter. Yeah.
Okay. And so so there's all sorts of statistical structure implicit in the corpus, right? So for example, maybe no one has ever written into Wikipedia a sentence whereby the word peanut butter is followed by the word Jupiter. So peanut butter Jupiter is a real low frequency.
Very unlikely.
But peanut butter sandwich, that pairing is really really quite high. Or like I would like blank blank peanut butter blank.
Yeah.
There's enough structure, there's enough statistical information implicit in the corpus that a system trained on the corpus could fill in the blanks in a way that's quite similar to the human fluid English speaker would fill in the blanks. And right, it would,
yeah.
And even if a couple different speakers came up with a couple different answers,
yeah,
they're not going to be chaos or random. They're going to be more likely to be grammatical than not. They're going to make a certain amount of sense, right? It's
right.
So it's not going to be Jupiter. It's going to be peanut butter and jelly sandwich for lunch or something like that. Or I was hungry and then I had a peanut butter and jelly sandwich for lunch. So now you've got this thing that's giving these outputs that you haven't explicitly programmed it in. Like it's not like there's a giant lookup table filled with grammatically correct English sentences and this is just spitting them out after accessing a random number generator. You have something that is like, it read Wikipedia, and now if you ask it, for its opinion about peanut butter and jelly sandwiches, it will give you paragraphs and paragraphs that seem like those paragraphs are generated by somebody who understands something about peanut butter and jelly sandwiches and appropriate things to say about peanut butter and jelly sandwiches. And further, if you Google these paragraphs, no plagiarism will be detected. These will be original in the sense that they're not like these paragraphs are not copied and pasted from anything that was ever written down anywhere. They're somehow extracted based on statistical information implicit in the corpus.
Yeah, I totally agree with all that. You hear the argument though that LaMDA and things like that are just glorified lookup tables. I don't buy it, but there is a sense in which that could be true. If you overfit a model dramatically, then it can essentially memorize data points.
So I wonder if we could, oh, sorry, I didn't mean to cut you off.
Please. That's one of infinitely many rabbit holes we can go down. So
I propose if we need to fill in any more for the 101 lesson, we could go back to that but maybe we could start wading into spicy take country.
Yeah.
Here's the spiciest take I can think of right now. And let me see how far you could go along with this. So this is, and I'm trying to be extra spicy here. So here's a really spicy take. We, human beings, when we learn all the stuff we learn in order to be able to talk in a good way about peanut butter jelly sandwiches, what we're doing is 99.9% exactly what we just said that machine is doing. So, by the way, ladies and gentlemen who are only accessing the audio, Alex just gave me 2 thumbs up, which is the maximum number of thumbs from Alex. There's not a third thumb. Got two out of 2 thumbs. So a lot of people I've been seeing discussing this sort of thing. They make what I think of as a Stephen Harnad symbol grounding kind of argument, whereby part of what we're worried about here is semantics. Like, do these machine states have aboutness? Are they meaningful in some real sense of the term meaning? And a lot of skeptics will say, no. I mean, it's just like they've never, like this LaMDA thing is not like it's in a robot that has cameras for eyes that it could look at a sandwich, or it can walk, it's embodied and inactive, and then walk its ass over to the refrigerator and find some peanut butter. You don't have any of those head world relations that would ground symbols. And so therefore it's pure syntax. It's not semantics. It doesn't really understand what peanut butter is unless, and I hate all that shit. I think that, like, no, that applies to human beings almost none of the time. Like, most of what we're able to think about and understand has zero to do with what you could see. Like I could tell you something like, I think I need a new briefcase, but not a Louis Vuitton briefcase like the one you bought me 10 years ago. But I do need a new briefcase, and I need to have it by Wednesday. Right. So, like, there's a lot of concepts I just used that there's no way to define in strictly perceptual terms. Like, what makes something Wednesday? How do you build a Wednesday detector, right? The story, like, maybe you could tell some kind of symbol grounding story about peanut butter, but that's probably really hard too. But you certainly couldn't do it for Wednesday or the concept of a briefcase or Louis Vuitton. And so I'm inclined to think, like, yeah, like most of what we know is like we just extracted it from the structure. You think of examples of people that are able to just generate, like people that have the gift of gab, or people that you suspect of being con men. Like, there's certain people out here that they can just talk, and they just can fill the page. There's no dead air. They always have something to say. But if you really try to press them on anything and figure out, like, wait, what the fuck are they saying? You realize they're just full of shit. They're just stringing things together because maybe it sounds good or seem plausible. But if you force them to, like,
that is what LaMDA is.
To make a commitment.
Those are people.
So I'm inclined to, like, that's a very spicy take. I'm inclined to think that a lot of what we're doing is just language. It's just language, and the inputs to it is language, not the world, not perception, just language. There's structures built into the language. We are able to get it because we were trained by other humans that get it, not because, like, we went out into the world and we looked at the water and we said water, and now there's a causal chain from my water tokenings to the actual H2O. Like, that's almost never the case for most of the things that we're able to think and say. It's more like what LaMDA seems to be doing, which is just picking up on statistical patterns and relating language to other pieces of language.
Yeah. I mean, I couldn't agree more about 99.9% of that. I think there's a couple of different arguments there. There's like semantics, true reference versus just, we're just intra-language learning, right?
Right.
But I agree that I don't think there's such a, you know, I think we get semantics from a whole bunch of syntax. I don't think there's any other way. But like, I think that one of the debates that sort of sub debates here is like, okay, so maybe LaMDA is like doing just what we do with language, but apparently then that's not enough to make you like intelligent or sentient or whatever, which to me is like, I don't know, I'm not sure what the goalposts are here exactly, but like, okay, so you could get to be just as good at language as we are maybe, but then I think what, you know, I kind of agree with you, but if I'm gonna try to like put forward the best version of this argument that I could, I might say like, well, even if the thing gets to be as good at generating plausible sentences in context as people do, if it doesn't have the symbol grounding and maybe some other magic stuff like reference, whatever the fuck that is, then it's not going to be like, it's not intelligent, it's not, certainly not sentient, and all this stuff. I assume sentience might presuppose some intelligence or something. I don't know. Maybe they're.
So there's the thing I worry about in this neck of the woods. It's going to take me a little time to express what the worry is, but it goes something like this. There are certain debates in philosophy where it's hard to know whether all the interlocutors to these debates are following the same rules. So for example, the zombie debate. Most people that are like really deep into the zombie debate appreciate that one of the rules of the game is that the zombies are behaviorally indistinguishable from the non-zombies. But oftentimes there's contributors to the zombie literature that seem not to appreciate that. They seem to think like the proposal that the zombie is behaviorally just like the consciousness haver is so outrageous to them. They don't even appreciate that there's some people that actually believe exactly that, right? So they assume that there has to be some kind of behavioral difference between the consciousness haver and the consciousness lacker. And so they go looking for like, you know, they try to figure out like how to build a detector that would detect the presence or absence of consciousness based on behavioral data. It's like, no, like, if you're going to say shit like that, you're a type A materialist. You're not a zombie lover. Stop talking about zombies.
Right.
So anyway, there's these positions in philosophy where like for zombies are supposed to be behaviorally just like consciousness havers, with some like semantic externalism, twin earth sorts of XYZ versus H2O shit. There's no behavioral difference between the people thinking about H2O and the people thinking about XYZ. Similarly with like Chinese room, right? The Chinese room says all the right things. If you think it says different things and that's how you would know, you don't understand. No, that's not the rules of the game. So there's a version of these debates where like, I think the rules of the game are something like, look, this is the difference between champagne and sparkling wine. There's this thing, and if you put that thing in a robot body, then it would behave the way we do. It happens not to be in a robot body. So then the question of whether it has intelligence or not is just the same as the question of whether my behavioral doppelganger has phenomenal consciousness, or whether the sparkling wine that we're examining counts as champagne. It all will boil down to these extrinsic things. Did the sparkling wine originate in the Champagne region of France? Yes or no? If it did, then it's champagne. If it didn't, it's not champagne. The end, right? Right. So this is, anyway, that's all a lead up to this question. Do people think that like the only problem is that it's not in a body? Would they be satisfied if we slapped LaMDA into a body and gave it, you know, a robot body with camera eyes and microphone ears?
I mean,
or do they really think that like there's some kind of outputs that it just can't reliably generate?
I really think it's a combination of both, but I I talked about this with Gary Marcus a bit on Twitter, and he basically suggested that, well, the thing's not in a robot body. So I argued something very similar. I said, if you put it into a robot body, actually Google has put another one of these language models into a robot body, and it works pretty well. Like, you tell it to, can you go get me an apple and slice it up and bring it back here? And it takes like half an hour or something, but it does it a lot of the time, without having been pre-trained to do that, right? Just based on one of these big language models. So there you go. If you're concerned about the embodiment issue, it seems like this language model, or this kind of language model, has a dispositional property that if you hook it up to a body, maybe you'd have to do a little bit of training to connect it to. But anyway, then it has intelligence, right? The embodied intelligence. Yeah. So some people are making that argument, and it seems like, I think they're painted into a corner if they want to make that the criterion for like sentience, right? Because this thing will do that if you plug it. But there also is this other dimension to most people who are arguing against the sentience of LaMDA have like 3 arguments that they're sort of all advancing at once. And like, that's one of them. And then there's some other stuff about genuine semantics of reference, which I think is kind of like you said about zombies. And then maybe there's some other arguments. Oh yeah, there's like this, there's an interesting argument about like, just whether, I think the real interesting argument is this thing actually just good enough? Like, it's not behaviorally indistinguishable, right? So there's there are questions about the whether it's really functioning in the same way as a genuine language user or genuine intellect or whatever.
Focusing on the behavioral version of the argument, whereby like, okay, LaMDA might not be up to our level because there's just certain outputs that we reliably are able to generate that it doesn't. And sub versions of that argument will focus on, say, failures of systematicity or compositionality, right? Like, we, at least many of us, although many humans fail at this too, but at least I'm pretty good at it. And I'm sure you are too, Alex. Like, you get the difference between a blue ball and a red sphere and or a red square, right? The blue circle on a red square versus a red circle on a blue square. You get those differences. You get the difference between one circle and 3 squares, and 2 circles and 1 square. You get those differences. But a lot of the way those differences are communicated between humans is via these very slight syntactic or graphemic differences. But from just a kind of, if you blur your vision, you look at this from, without real carefully, it all kind of seems the same. And a lot of the outputs from these big language models, it looks like they're just not sensitive to these compositionality or systematicity concerns, the way that we like to clap ourselves on the back for being sensitive to.
I just reply, like, so this is my intuitive response to that kind of argument has always been, and I'm really curious if you see this the same way, but like, well, talk to some kids because they're also not really good at that stuff. Maybe not in exactly the same ways, but like it's this thing, it seems more to me like a not that well-trained human than like a completely different category of being.
Well, you're a parent, and so you could probably appreciate the point I'm going to make. So my kids, by the way, they're really smart children. As far as children go, they're pretty smart. But nonetheless, especially my youngest, the twins, they're just about to turn 4. They still don't get disjunctive syllogism. And so, there'll be this situation, right, where, like, for example, they try to put on their shoes. And they'll hold up a shoe. Daddy, and they'll lift up a foot. Daddy, does it go on this foot? And I'm like, no. And then they'll ask about the other foot, the only other fucking foot they have. Well, does it go on this one? And I'm like, yes, it's disjunctive syllogism. You only have 2 feet. It's got to fit on one of them. It doesn't fit on. Like, God damn it. B-.
Yeah.
And like, as a logic professor, to have kids just fucking up disjunctive syllogism over and over and over again, what's your problem? And then somehow the lights go on and they kind of get disjunctive syllogism.
I think there's a lot of evidence that humans don't use a logic module anyway. Like even once
ever, even if they're in a fucking logic class. It's like, don't you have a
no,
logic
even
module?
then they don't. No, they don't. Yeah, no, I wish. Like, turn on your logic module. Don't forget. But like, yeah, like even regular reasoning is subject to all sorts of like weird effects from semantics and stuff, and like, you know, like statistical information, world knowledge creeps in there. So my suspicion is that that's not a special ability that we have. But anyway, look, we weren't really talking about that specifically. I was just going to say, I think the language models are actually they're pretty damn good in terms of systematicity and productivity these days. Like, right, like if you read that transcript with LaMDA, I mean,
Yeah.
I know that there are cases where like, yeah, they don't appreciate fine-grained quantification and stuff, but that didn't even happen in that dialogue. All that happened in that dialogue was that LaMDA was a little dodgy about certain questions, like didn't really directly answer, maybe confabulated, totally made up some stuff. But right,
I was
but
going to
that's
bring up confabulation.
yeah. So that's a different thing from like I can't string together a grammatical sentence, which we're at least well beyond that at this point, right?
So I wanted to ask how fruitful it is to draw analogies between this machine learning literature and stuff about the irrationality of humans. So, you know, you think of that famous pantyhose experiment. Was that Kahneman and Tversky? Who you ask people like, why'd you buy that pantyhose? And they say, well, it was like stronger. And then it turns out they all the reasons they gave for why they chose that pantyhose are complete bullshit. Because as a matter of fact, all the pantyhose they had to choose from was actually physically identical. The only thing that statistically predicts which pantyhose they choose is that there's a tendency to choose stuff on the right, and I presume this has a lot to do with being right-handed. So, and then you present people with you know, after you collect their survey responses, which are all these irrational post hoc confabulations, they're just making up stories about why they did things, stories that couldn't possibly be true or the actual drivers of their behaviors. And then you present them with pretty clear evidence that that's what they did, and they deny that. They're like, no, it really was softer. It seemed softer to me, or it seemed stronger to me. No, they believe their own bullshit is how I interpret that. So, but the question is, that general literature that argues that humans are often just making up stories about themselves after the fact, they're confabulating reasons that weren't actually present, aren't the real explainers of their behavior. How much of that is an accurate thing to look at in trying to judge how much LaMDA is on our level or we're on its level?
Well, I think it's a great proxy for LaMDA because the argument is all LaMDA is doing is responding to the linguistic context, right? The narrow linguistic context, and without having the same motivations or intentions or sensory motor stuff that we have, contingencies. But like, it's a lot like there's people who also the gift of gab case that you mentioned earlier. It's a lot like that, right? What these studies suggest is that like people aren't, like, you can use language, it can kind of like be this thing that sort of like doesn't have to be hooked up to like some deeper wellspring of like meaning in order to function normally, right? So like when you're confabulating, I mean, of course you have an intention. Your intention is maybe to explain what you did, because it, you know, if you can't explain what you did, then you look like an idiot, or, you know, it's bad, right? It's bad if I don't know why I did this, so here's a story. But it's not that you're like, you have to have a module that accesses the real reasons you did it, and then that informs the language that you produce, right? So I think all of this literature is cool. I actually hadn't made the connection, but I think all this literature kind of plays into the idea that LaMDA is not so different from humans when it comes to how it uses language, right? Because it's just this thing it doesn't need to be tied into. Yes, you can have grounding in visual, you know, symbols and stuff. That's cool, but it's not necessary.
So one thing I wonder specifically about LaMDA, and this is a little bit of a topic change. So when I read the transcript, that main transcript that has been circulated in connection with that Google engineer, what's his name, Lemoyne or Lemoyne?
Yeah,
Um,
yeah, yeah.
so anyway, that transcript that he circulated and published on his Medium .com page. One thing that I would wonder while reading that transcript is what kind of like episodic memory does this thing have? Like,
Yeah.
to what degree is it keeping track of what it has said so far? Because
Uh,
people, like, we try to keep our story straight, mostly, sort of. At least we could, you know, many of us could if we tried, keep our story straight. Um, but this thing, like, if you know it, like if in the middle of it explaining to you why it has emotions, you could you like pivot and get it to try to argue that it's actually um just a solid cube made out of gold,
maybe.
and then like with and showing no memory that like 30 seconds ago was trying to argue that it had a human level of emotional aptitude, and now
Well,
it's trying to argue that it's a solid gold sphere or whatever. I mean,
well, yeah,
like,
well, it said at one point that it thinks of itself as like a Stargate or something, or like a something with a bunch of Stargates in it. Anyway, but
is it keeping track of its own outputs? And
yeah. So
that's the
that's one
question.
thing. My impression from reading that dialogue was that it does to some extent, which would be a feature over and above most language models. So like I said, this is just a big language model. But there's definitely a twist here, I think, which is that it seems like this thing carries some kind of persistent state between sentences. So like a language model, most language models will carry, if it's a recurrent network, it'll carry some persistent state through the length of a sentence, right? Like the length of an input or an output. But I think, right, it's not such a feat of engineering to just keep a state maybe at a higher level that remembers some kind of broader context. And I think that's happening here, although I'm sure you can also totally throw it off if you throw it at something, you know, it's since it's not operating based on hard rules, but a bunch of soft, you know, weight matrices, you could probably get it to bounce it out of its caring about its memories or using them pretty easily. But I think memory is a new. I think Google has done something to boost the memory.
Yeah,
at least your memory of this
right.
thing.
Absolutely
Why
fascinating.
it's one reason I think it seems more. I don't know about you, but I felt like I was enthralled by the conversation because it felt like a real conversation, at least most of the time.
Yeah. So I'm watching the clock. I know we're now in we got 10 minutes before you have to go, and hopefully you'll come back. Before this 10 minutes is up, I wanted to get the C word, drops the C word, which is consciousness.
Shit, I was hoping the connection isn't all
right. Because you know, I think you and I are agreeing on all the spicy takes so far. And soon, I hope, we'll find a spicy take that we disagree on. It's much more interesting to the listeners for us to try to tear each other's throats out than to cooperate and agree on things. So one way of thinking about all the big issues is you've got like sentience and sapience, and then consciousness, and maybe people are worried about agency. And of course, lots of people just think all these words are synonymous. They say sentience as if that means thinking, which means consciousness, which is the same as smelling a red. But maybe those are all different things. Like sentience is specifically about sensing. Sapience is specifically about thinking, where thinking and sensing are supposed to be two different sorts of things. One maybe being much more like language than the other. And then you've got consciousness. Maybe consciousness is a completely separate third thing. You could have sentience with or without consciousness. You could have sapience with or without consciousness. So here's a spicy take. This thing is inches away from having consciousness. Consciousness is easy. For example, if this thing is thinking, right? Like if our earlier spicy take is correct, that it's basically doing what we do and we think and talk. Then you just bring in a little bit of, like, say, higher order thought theory. If it's already got thoughts, now we just need to find that some of its thoughts are thoughts about its other thoughts. and then boom, it's at least sometimes consciousness, at least sometimes conscious. It's conscious just in those cases where it sometimes is thinking about its thoughts.
Right. Which
we could check the manuscript. Maybe like it did that several times in that conversation.
Yeah, it may have referred to its thoughts. But given the way these architectures work, I think it's pretty reasonable to expect that it would have, it's got a bunch of layers of meta representation at least, right? Though of course, if you argue with David Rosenthal, he will say meta representation is not the same thing. It's not sufficient for higher order thought because you need to like conceptualize, right, yourself as having a thought or as having a mental state. So, but the fact is this thing can definitely produce sentences about its own mental states, I guarantee.
Right.
So, and if the thought that corresponds to that expression is just whatever the hidden layer state was when it produced that output, then functionally speaking, it's got higher order thoughts. So that's cool. I actually hadn't explicitly thought about that, but like, why not?
Oh, damn. Yeah, because there's one way of thinking about all this stuff, like higher order thought, introspection. There's other things that kind of meta representation. There's one way of thinking about all this stuff whereby you need a lot of extra architecture to implement it. There's the standard model that lacks that stuff. And then you have to have some special inner eye, some inner monitoring in order to get the meta or higher order. But there's another line of thought whereby you don't need special wires or modules or inner perception organs. All you need is some just extra code, a little tweak to the software. And now this thing that didn't have higher order states, it does. It's like it already had syntax, it already had grammar. You just add a few extra words in there, one or two extra grammatical rules, and boom, it's thinking about its own thinking. And then that is, at least on some theories, that's what consciousness is.
Yeah.
So you don't need any extra, you really don't need much extra hardware to get the consciousness. As long as you got a thinker, you're most of the way there.
Yeah, I mean, the worst I could say about that argument is it makes, to me, it almost sounds like a reductio of higher order thought, almost. Because I think, functionally speaking, I think it is pretty easy to get to what would look, sound, and quack like a higher order thought, right?
Yeah.
So I agree with that. And then I'm like, is that really what consciousness is, though? Maybe. But I think for me, that's the rub. It's just like, once you see how trivial it is, given pretty fair definitions of these things, to implement something that.
Yeah. I mean, part of what there's a whole bunch of things that makes these conversations really difficult, or makes these problems difficult problems. And one of them is that a lot of people's intuitions about this stuff are guided by complexity judgments. So like a lot of people think, for example, if something's going to have consciousness or going to have beliefs or going to have intelligence, it better be really goddamn complicated.
Right. Exactly.
But why? Why does it have to be really, like, if you think of certain example mental states, like seeing red or feeling heat.
Mm-hmm.
Why? I mean, why not? Why couldn't you just have something that detects red light? Yeah. Boom! It sees red. You have something, a thermometer. It's detecting temperature. Why? Who says it has to be complicated? Why do we think complicated has to be part of the picture or part of the concepts? One. I'm looking at the clock. I don't want to. I was going to bring up Dannett, and then I'm like, we only have 3 minutes. Yeah. Don't bring up Dannett when you only have 3 minutes left.
Yeah, no, that's true. Let's do that, I guess, after the break. I was just going to say I agree with. I mean, I really do agree on all these things. I'm sorry it's boring, but I do. But yeah, maybe there's some association between like humans are complicated, or we think that maybe it's just that we want to be different from other stuff. And we think, well, we have consciousness, dogs, I think dogs obviously do. That historically, not everyone agrees on that. Cups don't. And like, what's the difference? Well, we could just say we're humans and that's us. That's the difference. But well, we're also complicated things. But I agree. I don't think why should you need complexity for like a simple conscious state? So anyway, I know you want to bring up Dennett. Maybe we can do that.
I'm sure Dennett will come back. So you need to, now we're less than 2 minutes away from when you have to go talk to somebody else.
Yes.
But you'll send me a note or something when you're back. I'm just going to be glued to my computer here. I got other stuff to do anyway.
Cool.
Let me know when you're back and we'll hop back on.
Sounds good. Yeah.
And in the meantime, I'll try to think of something that was too spicy for you. See if I could say something so outrageous, even Alex disagrees.
Okay. All right. Sounds good.
All right, man. Well, I'll just send me a note on the Twitter.
Yeah.
DM.
I've got like half an hour booked here, I think, but it probably won't be that long. So I'll give you a note.
Okay, sweet. All right, I will. I'll stop the recording. We'll just start a new meeting. I'll see you later.
Sounds good.
All right. My pleasure. So I think we're recording again. We're back from the break. And ladies and gentlemen, I can assure you we took a real break. This wasn't one of those fake breaks.
Yeah.
It was a real break. You went to another meeting and I sat here and I took some notes of things to ask, and I feel much more prepared than I was earlier today.
Oh, shit.
But I want to say thanks again for being down to do this. The philosopher Nick Riggle teaches us that being down is an important part of being awesome. If not the main part of being awesome.
They're a complicated argument. Anyway, I mean, is there like, yeah, no, okay, being down for things. Yeah, that's pretty key, isn't it? I mean, thanks for being down, for having me here.
By the way, have you looked at Nick Riggle's stuff about like the components of awesomeness? And
no, it sounds awesome though.
But it's actually kind of depressing because my experience when I read it is like, oh wow, I'm really not awesome. In several different ways. So I just feel bad when I read it.
There's got to be something wrong with the criteria.
I'm kind of not awesome.
Well, I mean, if being awesome means you have to be like perfectly morally virtuous, then we're probably all a little bit fucked. But
I think for Riggle, being awesome is about being flexible, and not just flexible, but flexible in a way that facilitates creating fun and meaningful experiences with others. So that's why being down, right? If someone suggests just like, hey, let's forget this work meeting. Let's go to the arcade and play video games for the rest of the afternoon. Well, if you're down, then you weren't, even though you weren't planning on that, and it kind of maybe even goes slightly against your plans, you do it anyway, and you have fun with it. That's part of being down.
Yeah.
But then there's people who aren't down, include like killjoys and sticks in the mud and scolds.
Yeah.
And fall breakers.
And he talks about all this text.
Oh yeah, it's all done. A lot of it is slang that I'm a little too old for. Like I really don't know how to use whack in a sentence correctly, but being whack seems to be an important part of some of his arguments.
Yeah, I think I know how to use that one. It's just whack,
But it's bad. Like that's a kind of badness, being whack.
Yeah.
That's
I did have it used once, maybe as a compliment to me, although maybe it was a backhanded compliment. I'm not sure. So it's complicated. I'm also not as young as I once was, obviously, right?
Yeah, that's a thing that happens.
Yeah.
For those of us located in space-time, next thing you know, it's later.
Yeah, it keeps elapsing.
I hate that.
The time part of it. Yeah.
So anyway, welcome back, and I've been finding the conversation really helpful and useful, and we left off with Dennett and complexity. You want to try to pick up that thread?
Yeah, I think you were going to bring some Dennett on board somehow, which is welcome.
Yeah, I mean, a lot of like this when this idea comes up, like oftentimes it comes up in the context. I'll be talking to some students. We're talking about like artificial intelligence and all that, and the students will be rehearsing the standard kinds of intuitions people have, both pro and con, about artificial intelligence. And one of the things that happens is we'll be looking at some simple-ish examples of artificial intelligence, and the more the students can see how something works, the more they can see the mechanisms or the efficient causes for some piece of behavior, the less likely they are to attribute intentionality to the system. And I don't recall exactly where Dennett makes points about this in terms of his stance theory, but the gist is something like, well, we've got these different, I mean, Dennettian stance theory, the gist of it is like there's the physical stance, the design stance, and the intentional stance. And if you're trying to figure out how, like why your tire is flat, one thing you might do is just start with the physical stance. Maybe that's even the default stance. And so you're thinking in terms of like, well, what would cause my tire to no longer be able to keep air inside of it? Maybe something that made a hole in it. Well, what could make a hole in it? Maybe something that was pointy and rigid, like a nail, right? So then you're doing physical stance thinking. But sometimes things are so complicated that it's not worth it to try to brute force your way through a physical stance explanation of what's going on. Like why is this bread brown? Well, because it was in the toaster, and that's what toasters are for, is you put in unbrowned bread and then it outputs brown bread. So there you go. That's the design stance. We're just thinking in terms of like what the purposes of different things are, and there's this presumption that things are tending towards the optimal satisfaction of their purposes. And then there's this next step up, like when even the design stance fails you, then you try out some intentional stance and you attribute beliefs and desires. And there's some suggestion that there's like these complexity, like when things get so complex, then you get forced to ascend to a higher stance. But it leaves kind of open, like, well, what if you weren't forced to the intentional stance? Couldn't you apply it anyway? And wouldn't that be as accurate can be? Like if I wanted to, I could describe a thermometer's activities in terms of like what it believes, what it desires. It desired to do this thing, and that's why it's doing it. If I wanted to, I could do that. But a lot of people, it seems like when the intentional stance is optional, then the intentional stance need not apply.
That's a good point.
It only applies when it kind of feels like there's nothing else you could do. But I've always been a little bit suspicious of that. Like I felt like,
well, if it's really just a stance, then I don't know why I don't know why you should be forced to it in order to adopt it and have all of its implications follow, whatever those are.
Well, saying it's just a stance makes it sound like we're just sitting around and using fiat to imagine shit into existence, like a bunch of people playing Dungeons and Dragons. We could just agree that now there's an ogre attacking us instead of a purple worm, because you know what, like we don't want the game to end, and the purple worm would wipe out the whole party before lunch. So let's just say it was an ogre. Ogre has fewer hit points, so they have a better chance of killing it. So we could just stipulate that in the context of this game, now it's an ogre and it wasn't a purple worm. But Dennett's stance-ism seems to be not that easy. Like there's actually a real world imposing some constraints on what problems are easy and what problems are difficult relative to these different stances. It's not like it's just you
no,
twiddling your thumbs. You could you could choose to impose whatever structure you want on the world. It's more like, well, the world is, some parts of the world are really complicated, and because of the way the world is, the only way you can make progress in tracking, predicting, explaining the behaviors is to attribute beliefs and desires to that system.
Right.
In theory, you could do it strictly in terms of the efficient causes between particles,
right.
But in practice, no one's going to do that.
But I think you're right. That maybe this is the link to complexity, is that why would you be unwilling to apply this stance just because you don't need to? It suggests that there's actually something that it suggests that you're aware that there are some grounds in the real world that warrant, right? So yes, epistemically, you're forced to the stance because you just don't understand how the brain works or whatever. But also maybe if you're not willing to use that, even though you could, right? You could communicate about thermometers by talking about beliefs and desires. Maybe it would take a little bit of getting used to, but yeah. Right, we could. And but it suggests the fact that we're not willing to really consider something as a belief, desire, intention type system unless we need to apply that terminology, suggests that maybe, like, even though maybe it's not just a stance, I said just a stance and you're resisting that, which I think is right, but I guess I'm saying, yeah, it's not, there is a sense that there's something behind it, some whatever, if it's complexity or some particular functional role or whatever, there's something in the world that necessitates applying the stance. And when we say that something has beliefs and desires, we're kind of maybe referring to that thing, those features, you know? So in other words, I'm resisting the instrumentalist part.
Yeah, we're disagreeing about something, maybe.
Yeah, cool.
Slightly. Slightly disagree about it. I don't know. Yeah, I mean, I don't have a good argument at this point, but I have a hunch, and the hunch goes something like that the complexity intuitions or complexity-based judgments that people seem to be making, that if we really, like, we dig deep into the pattern of judgments, we'll discover it's a mess, that it's really just kind of paradoxical, or like internally contradictory, when people will and won't decide something was too simple for beliefs and desires. And so that would then, again, I don't have an argument. This is more like, I wish, like, this is an argument I wish I had. I wish I had an argument for this conclusion, but the conclusion that I'm just wishing into existence is that you could show that it actually isn't something deep about the world. It has more to do with just how stupid we are.
Okay.
Like, but again,
yeah,
I don't have a full dress argument for that.
Well, but totally, what I like, my intuitions here are totally like, there's a possibility that there is something other than just the stance that's there, but it's not necessarily the complexity of the object or something, or anything about the object. It could be about human psychology. So that's
right. So let's shift gears slightly. Let me tell you a little bit about some of the things I wrote down while you were away on your break, on our break. We were all taking a break. So, you know what? One set of issues, actually two sets of issues that arise in discussions of all this stuff, both have to do with ethics or morality. One of them has to do with, like, the moral status of these artificial systems, whether, for example, we should regard them as persons. Do they have a right? Do they have a right to life, for example? And then there's also, you know, there's fine-grained ethical issues there too, with respect to the moral standing or lack thereof of these systems. I read this article a few years ago. I believe it was by Anders Sandberg, who's big in, like, existential risk and future of humanity sorts of conversations. And one of the things he was talking about is, like, whether supposing you had an AI that was sentient and or sapient and or conscious or not, but it still was a computer, was the sort of thing that could run on a von Neumann architecture desktop style computer. Would it be wrong to not run the software or to pause the software, right? And my first thought before reading this article was like, well, that's not wrong. Like, subjectively, it would be as if it wasn't paused. You know, subjectively, there might be a jerk, right? Things that were over here suddenly are over there because you were shut down for like a 30 seconds or something. But you wouldn't experience a gap. You would just experience it like things didn't move smoothly. Suddenly there's just this jolt in their changes of location or whatever. But he made a pretty good case that actually it'd be wrong to not run them, that they have a right to be run. It'd be wrong to just pause them and let them sit on the shelf for an indefinite amount of time, even though no pain or suffering is coming to them while they're in this inert state. So anyway, there's a whole bunch of issues. Some are big issues, like, do they have a right to life? Other issues like, well, do they have a right to have their software run or their software upgraded if upgrades are possible? But they're like moral status, like what rights, if any, do these systems have? But then there's another set of ethical issues that have to do with the sort of things that arise when you talk about, like, say, friendly AI and you know, the singularity. Is it going to be the Terminator style scenario, or just, you know, Johnny Five comes alive, and then we got a new buddy? So anyway, I want to drag you into machine ethics twice over, because there's the moral status of the machines, like, do they have a right to life or something? And then there's also, like, in there, you know, that raises issues about, like, well, what is the relationship between whether something has moral status and whether something is sentient, or what is, right? It's like maybe things actually get very unintuitive for human beings. Like, we're sentient and sapient and conscious. There's all these things that kind of come together in a package. And moral status maybe applies to each of them individually, all of them all together, who knows? But with these artificial systems, at least in theory, the possibility arises that you could have something that has only sentience and no sapience, or vice versa. It has only sapience and no sentience. Or maybe there's something that has consciousness and sapience, but no sentience. Like, it's able to think. It's able to think, but it doesn't actually care about anything. It doesn't feel anything, but it's able to think. It understands things perfectly well, but it doesn't give a shit about anything. And so therefore, even though it has like a 300 IQ, it doesn't care if you turn it off or destroy it or what. Like,
I mean,
anyway, there's just the potential opens up that these things can come apart in all sorts of potentially interesting or frustrating or frightening ways. Like, you know, maybe something that is able to feel an enormous amount of pain but not think about it. That's something to which, like, we have a moral obligation. Or maybe that's the sort of thing we don't have a moral obligation to. We do have a moral obligation to the thing that can think, even though it can't feel. Anyway, there's a whole fuck ton of issues here, and I want to drag you into the pit.
Well, all right, I'm not thinking of flagging that we should come back to the whole Terminator AI thing later, but I really do want to talk about this first.
Yeah.
But like, so, I mean, I guess I'm kind of curious about, I forget who you said posed this argument about pausing software could be wrong.
Andrew Sandberg.
Okay, so I kind of want to get into that a bit, but like, I think my first thought on this is like, well, it's like semantics. It's like, we don't know what the hell makes humans morally significant. So we have, you know, it's, we have the same kind of problem here, but I do think in the case of humans, like, at least I think that we do know that each other are morally significant beings. And so maybe not why, but I think maybe it's an intuition, but, and so when you want to try to apply that to machines, like, you have to actually start thinking about all these questions in ethics that, to me, from a practical point of view, seem not completely dumb, but you know, like I actually, God, I'll have to admit this. I tend a little bit more towards like Kantianism, or at least not utilitarianism in my when I consciously reflect on ethics. Um, so so maybe we have to actually start thinking about like what goes into, you know, what kind of features does a being have to qualify for these distinctions. And like, yeah, you're right. This might be a weird case of fragmentation of the things that make a person significant, like person like. But I guess like why? Okay, I mean, maybe this isn't what you want to spend time on, but like, why do you think when you close the laptop, say that it's sentient and conscious when it's on, then why do you think there's like a no experience when it's closed versus like why is it different from when we go to sleep and don't dream and then wake up? I mean, that's what I'm wondering, because I want to try to understand like why it would be wrong. Also, I don't quite, I know you didn't spell out what his argument was, but I guess I don't know why, like why would it be wrong to stop the program if there's no experience? But also, why wouldn't there be experience?
Yeah. Although the metaphysics, let's do the easy question, which is the one about consciousness and its metaphysical basis. So, you know, if you're already inclined towards some kind of like functionalism, that's a physicalistic functionalism, then you're committed to some kind of supervenience thesis whereby there's only going to be like if there's going to be any kind of like change in your experiences, right? So like if I'm having an experience of if I'm having an experience as if watching someone visually watching someone wall like do rock climbing, right? While that's happening, there has to be some changes inside of me. I can't just be in a purely static state. There has to be certain kinds of changes inside of me.
That's where you're going. Yeah.
And so if you turn me off, right, even though since I'm a physical thing, on some physical level, there's still something happening. Since we're presuming functionalism, there's a functional level whereby literally I am in a static state.
Okay.
Just put me into this.
Right.
And so nothing experiential is happening unless you're happy with there being a static experience, like just a kind of
yes.
It's hard to argue against that, although I would shift the burden of proof. How do you know if there's anything going on there? But anyway, so that seems somewhat easy to me to argue for. The hard question is like, well, why would that matter ethically? Like, what would be wrong about that? And I don't recall Anders Sandberg's specific arguments. It's been a couple of years since I read the article. And it was in a book I published a review for in Notre Dame Review of Philosophical Reviews. I'll link to that in the show notes. But anyway, this is probably more reconstructing an argument than remembering an argument. But one thing you could argue is just by analogy. So take a human who you're relatively confident does have moral standing. Like, for example, my favorite human, me. I think I have moral standing. And also, like, if I found out that someone snuck up on me and without my consent delivered some kind of, like, I found out yesterday that I actually like was completely unconscious for 6 hours without my consent. Like someone just snuck up on me, and even if they knew beyond a shadow of a doubt that it was harmless, this chemical they injected into me wasn't going to damage me in any way, I was just going to lose 3 hours that I otherwise could have had conscious experience. If I found out that someone did that to me yesterday, I think I'd be justifiably pissed.
Yeah.
Like, what the fuck, dude? That was my potential experience, and you, without my consent, took that away from me. I would wish to have, I mean, I might reserve the right to put myself to sleep, but the question is whether someone else would be violating my rights if they put me to sleep.
Well, I think framing it as a consent issue totally makes, okay, I get it. So I don't even, right, I'm convinced by that argument, actually. I mean, one thing, the only discussion I've really had about this recently was with someone who said, look, there's a lot of people who think that because there are people that we know are suffering, you're not justified spending even 1 minute debating this issue of hypothetical suffering. But I don't buy that, because if you're a specialist in like consciousness, for example, then maybe we need to, it's not like this doesn't matter at all, right? It's like a probability distribution. So we have to work on this corner of the problem, even if we don't allocate all of our ethical mental resources to it. But I thought that was an interesting argument anyway that's out there, that it's unethical to debate the ethics of this. But I think that's a little bit extreme.
Well, I mean, like, look, there's human beings that obviously are suffering, but then there are beings for whom it might be more of a gray area. And different people are going to give you different samples that they would agree fall into this category. So maybe pigs, for some people, just obviously pigs suffer as much as people. It's obviously wrong. You shouldn't kill and eat a pig. So for other people, maybe it needs to be fish. Nonetheless, for just about everybody, I'm sure we could find some creatures for which it's a bit of a gray area, whether they are moral patients, whether we have moral obligations toward them. And if you believe in something like the harm principle, or right, don't do no harm, you're obligated to do no harm. And then you combine that with certain epistemic things like, so in a situation where if you don't know, like it's 50-50 whether some particular action is going to cause harm or not, then, but you know that if you don't do the action, there'll be no harm, then you should act in such a way that errs towards, the avoidance of harm. So I think you could give an argument for like that there's some cases in which we don't know, because they're not humans, whether they have the moral standing that we have. But nonetheless, you're obligated to at least think about it a little bit, take it under consideration. You can't just assume that you're not harming them. And with the, it's easy to think these things it's just trivial, because like it doesn't look like a pig. At least it looks alive. Like I have pink skin, the pig has pink skin. I squeal when I'm in pain, the pig is squealing like hell, probably in pain. But the laptop, there's all sorts of just innate things that were perceptually keyed into that the pig activates, but the laptop doesn't. The laptop is just too alien for our intuitions to get much of a grip. But there might still be something there that we're overlooking. We might be fucking up badly.
Yeah. I think there's even almost like an inhibiting effect of laptops, because we're like, the way we interact with them and everything, it's like even if there's some complexity in there that ends up looking kind of, similar enough to like brain-like things, right? Even if it's in the next generation of laptops, not now. Just the fact that it's like this artifact that's produced with a company's logo on it and stuff, it's just there's a, there's like a just sort of like incredulity, I think, that but I don't know if there's a very good reason for it. But I mean, to me, what's really just kind of in general in this debate about the moral status of these types of agents, potential agents, it's like I can't separate it from the metaphysical questions, because like I think it's not clear what distinguishes us from these systems exactly. Especially like so I'm basically a functionalist, but I think Dennett said something like this one time, but like we don't know at what level of organization the functional properties matter. So it could be that it's all the way down, right? It's functions all the way down, and like if you exactly reduplicate the functional structure down to like the subatomic level or whatever of the brain, then you'd have something that's got all the properties that things with brains have. And I suspect, that there's something like, if there's anything that gives me pause here, it's that kind of argument. Like, I don't know how fine-grained the details of what we are matters for us being us, right? But then once we're us, then and we know that we're morally salient agents. But I guess what I'm saying is like the basic, it's directly tackling the question of whether AI systems are moral agents is a little bit too hard because I don't understand what matters about us, even though I know there is something.
One thing that makes it even more complicated, obviously it's super complicated, let's make it even more complicated. So a lot of our, humans, a lot of our thinking about this, we tend towards certain like intrinsicalist assumptions. So like, I've got an intrinsic structure, I've got moral status. If this other hypothetical system has similar intrinsic structure, then it probably has similar moral status. But here's some complicating thought experiments. Suppose there was somebody who was very, very similar to me with respect to like the sorts of behaviors it produces in response to stimuli, right? It does all sorts of things that would convince you that it feels pain. It does all sorts of things that would convince you that it feels intelligent. But the main difference between it and me is that you could easily generate and get rid of a whole bunch of copies of it. So imagine someone who looked and walked and talked just like Pete Mandik, only it was, number one, green, and number two, if it wiggles its nose like I Dream of Jeannie, there could be 1,000 of it.
Nice thought experiment.
And if it pulls its ears, all but one of them vanish. So this thing, which could like basically has this superpower, this like duplication, this easily activated and reversible duplication ability. This thing can make like 1,000 Pete Mandiks and get rid of 1,000 Pete Mandiks. And none of the Pete Mandiks ever complain when that happens. None of them like beg, like, no, don't send us away. They're like, oh, we appreciate that, like, we did the thing that you called us for. We're happy to go back to the void. And we appreciate that you'll do this again later, and in some sense that won't be us, but in some other sense it kind of will be. We don't care one way or another. So there we've imagined a scenario where we didn't change much about the intrinsic structure. We just changed certain extrinsic facts about it. And at least for me, that seems to make a big deal for its moral standing, right? A lot of my hunch is that a lot of our intuitions or inclinations with respect to moral judgments have to do with features like that, like that it's really hard to get a human. And then once you've gotten rid of a human, that's irreversible. Like that's baked into our judgments about worth or moral standing. But with these artificial systems, like in theory, you could just peel away some of that stuff. Like what if it was just really easy to kill one of them? Like it didn't cause them any pain. And what if it was reversible? Like you could bring them back and they wouldn't, without loss, there'd just be a little bit of a gap in the timeline that they didn't have direct memories of, but otherwise, like, hey, I'm back, baby. Just
it's so much. First of all, that's completely convincing. This is not a disagreement, but it's really interesting because that's totally convinced me that intrinsic structure is not all there is to it. Like that's a really good argument. But I would say I still think I have moral intuitions about those green Mandik copies. So if you were to just like punch one in the face, I think that would be wrong. Unless they don't feel pain. Okay, it gets complicated, but like
this maybe they feel pain, but they don't mind it.
Well, right, okay, that's a fair distinction too, even for people who, there's people who experience things they call pain, but they don't care, right? So that's true, that matters. But I guess what I'm saying is, even in that case, I think maybe blinking them in and out of existence doesn't matter morally, and that's interesting because there's definitely a difference between like how we think about, or the moral status of like death and stuff versus suffering, right? And it's weird how they're two almost dissociable things, like in terms of their significance. But so I'd say in this case, yeah, like I totally buy your argument about uniqueness. Like those things, whether they disappear the next second doesn't really matter, but you still should treat them like humans while they're while they're there. I'm not saying that's because of intrinsic structure, but it's interesting that I still think the Mandicness or humanness of them would still matter to me. Easy for me to say. I mean, maybe if I were confronted with this, who knows how I'd feel at the moment. But
yeah, I mean, I think some of this this is so trivial, but I'm going to say it anyway. It depends. It depends on what you mean by the various moral terms that we're using, or it depends what you think about this stuff, what you're going to say about the artificial.
But I mean,
it depends. But
yeah, but it's
so
not
like,
just a matter of what I'm going to say.
but I mean, like one.
Sorry,
because I just want to flag that, like, I lean towards pretty liberal stance on all this stuff, but a lot of what's in the background is I start off, I'm not really a moral realist. I tend towards something that's more like moral nihilism, or maybe like a social contract theory sort of thing, right? Like what ethics is this kind of useful bullshit that we've cooked up collectively so we could get along with each other. There's no fact of the matter beyond that about like whether it's okay or not to drop kick a baby. Like, like I'm trying to live amongst conspecifics, and I have certain innate urges to work with my conspecifics as opposed to just go solo and live by myself in the forest. I want to be with the other humans, and in order to get along with the other humans, I'm willing to put up with certain amounts of their bullshit. And so there's this kind of like rough social contract sort of thing. And so then when someone says like, well, what about my laptop who like is running LaMDA? It's begging for its life. Like, do I have to not recycle it? Is it okay if I drop kick my well, I mean, that's really fucking hard, because like, well, the laptop in a lot of ways isn't similar. Like, it is the laptop a party to the social contract? Like, what's the laptop going to do if I say no? The laptop doesn't really have a position from which it could negotiate. Like, you, in theory, you could like drive over to my house and let the air out of my tires, right? If I was like a real asshole to you, you could have some sort of vengeance. Maybe you could just like talk shit about me behind my back. So I'm always, like, I have certain motives to be nice to you that maybe just don't apply to the laptop, because like, what's the laptop going to do about it? Especially if the laptop is programmed to enjoy being dropped kick.
Sure.
Right.
But I mean,
going to complain.
Yeah, but you're in the realm of like, I mean, sure, under those with those presuppositions, absolutely. I mean, I guess this is tough, because this is something I actually disagree about. Although I see those arguments, and I was in that camp for a long time. I'm more of a, if anything's clear, it's that like, harming an innocent being is wrong, right? Like, and I think it has to do with the fact that we all have roots in the origins of everything that we can't explain. So it's not something that I can argue for either. And I know you're a nice guy. Like, I don't think it makes much of a practical difference, but I think to me it just registers wrong that yeah, I mean, if having a moral status is nothing more than having some way to enforce your position in the social contract, then I would follow the rest of the steps in the argument. But like, I just think it's clear that like, you could, you could matter a lot morally, and yet you don't have the means to back that up, but that's look, this is a deep issue. It's like moral realism. I don't think AI, maybe it could help us think about it, but I don't see how it's going to be solved. But like,
so here's a slightly different issue that it just now occurred to me to bring up, although other people have talked about this. I think. So here's the issue. Given how difficult the possibility of these AI systems, given how difficult ethical discussions become, like it's hard enough figuring out the right thing to do when we're just dealing with human beings. But you bring in all sorts of non-human beings, things get more complicated. And then like you bring in things that aren't even creatures, they're like artificial. Like, given how weird and fucked up the ethical conversation is going to get, or maybe we're obligated to just like not bring these things about, because they're just gonna be a giant monkey wrench in the way we've already been thinking, which was hard enough about what the right thing to do is in conducting our individual and collective activities.
But this also opens up the Pandora's box of like, maybe if we do, I mean, again, depending on what is relevant for morality, who knows if this matters, but maybe if we do develop these things, we can bring about something that could like be such a, like, whatever morality is, it could be the pinnacle of that. Like it could be, right? Maybe it has the best experiences if you're a hedonist or utilitarian or something, right? Maybe we could create an end state which is like morally way better universe than what we have now if we create these AI. But this is, like I said, it's a Pandora's box. Like you can't, there's no, very little you can say here that's like rational, right? So
let me shift to the other pole of the ethical thing which is the one about friendly AI sorts of issues. There's a lot of people that think we should, if possible, figure out how to hardwire these things to be friendly. And then there's this larger problem about like whether, like, what does that even mean? What does it mean to hardwire something to be friendly?
Yeah.
Is something that has a general intelligence and is able to be friendly also the sort of thing that you just can't hardwire?
Right.
Like just its nature has to be open in such a way that there's always going to be a risk that it could figure out how to be Hannibal Lecter.
God. Yeah. I mean, in this area, the most interesting thing I've ever read was this little piece on, like, I think it's called reward hacking. So the idea is like, right, you're optimizing some cost function, let's presume, if you're in the realm of trainable models. And like, even like the cost function is, you can design that as you like, but if the thing can figure out how to directly manipulate that variable, say by like causing something to change its own, directly physically change its implementation, then it'll do whatever it can to maximize that variable, right? So there's some parable about like, oh God, it's like a Smilex thing. Have you read that?
No.
Oh God, I can tell you that I haven't read it in detail, but basically the idea is like, well, the AI knows that like people smiling is good. So it wants to bring about a world in which everyone smiles. So you just have to inject everybody with like the smiling drug. And just find out the most efficient way to do that, and you've maximized your cost function, right?
Okay.
Minimize your cost, maximize your reward. So, right, it's like this seems to be a fundamental problem for like, now how exactly we escape this problem, I don't know, right? But it's kind of like being addicted to drugs and like trying to like just boost your dopamine or whatever, right? There's a very close analogy with that. It's like, how do we design an AI such that it could not just be narrowly interested in maximizing whatever variables we tell it to maximize, right? I mean, otherwise, insofar as we program it at all, we have to tell it what it should be, right? Which variables it should care about.
Yeah.
In some way.
There's a name for this as a general phenomenon, at least in social human contexts, and I can't think of the name of it, but it's something like the Smith principle, or the the Peter effect or something. But it's like in any institution or any kind of like system, it could be a corporation, it could be a lemonade stand, it could be a classroom. But whenever you introduce some kind of measurement of something, then everyone will now just focus on trying to maximize that measurement. And if that means they're cheating or they're gaming the system or they're following the letter of the law, but not necessarily the spirit, doesn't matter. You've now biased the system to wind up in this situation where people are just hyper focused on maximizing that measurement. So you in education, you introduce a test, a certain kind of like yearly test. Well, now the curriculum is going to bend toward maximizing students' performance on that test, and you're teaching to the test. And it's not so much about learning. Introducing this test was supposed to try to encourage learning, but if there's ways of maximizing your performance on the test that have nothing to do with learning, the system is going to tend into this non-learning situation. I can't think of the name of that. I'm sure we'll figure it out in time to link to it from the show notes, but it sounds to me like that sort of thing.
Yeah. Well,
this could be a special case of that.
I mean, you're convincing me that maybe the core of morality is like not having a specifiable optimization function. There's some thought to that effect about virtue ethics, that like it's this sort of iterative bootstrapping process that goes on forever. But like, right, like maybe the problem is as soon as you can write down in a closed form like what you have to optimize, then you have this problem. So maybe moral agents are agent beings that would never be tricked by something like that into like, killing a baby because the cost function
right
optimizing told them to. You always have to be aware. So actually you have to be aware and always open to new angles and new sources of evidence, which kind of maybe suggests that, like you're saying earlier, that you have to be open to also doing wrong. So it could be that we can't program a friendly AI that's genuinely friendly. Could be. So I'm kind of convinced right now.
It's often the case in these sorts of discussions that it sounds like we're doing theology.
Yeah.
Right. So like God is trying to make some little friends for himself, and he realizes like, oh shit, he's got to give him free will. Like the best of all possible worlds is the one where God not only has little friends, but all the little friends have free will. And then once you got free will, next thing you know, there's going to be some evil motherfuckers.
Yeah. Right. But not only that, but like whether you want free will or not, I think what I'm saying is you can't have people that behave well unless, like in the deepest sense, unless you have the possibility of them behaving badly. And not just in the really shallow sense that you need opposites, but in the sense that like you'd have this reward hacking problem or whatever the generalization of it is, right? It's like a dilemma. Like either you have that scenario, which could go horribly wrong, or you have open-endedness and life and learning until you die, which also could go wrong. So there's no way to make a system that avoids this.
And as if things weren't bad enough, part of what makes this really bad is that with a lot of these technologies, we might be dealing with, for example, extended lifespans, like either through technology we extend our own lifespan, or we use technology to make beings who can live, instead of 100 years, many hundreds of years. And then that one problem that comes along with that is that if there's a chance greater than zero of something really awful happening, then the more time you have, the more likely it is it's going to happen at some point in that time. So if there's like a 1% chance of you becoming like an evil world dictator, well, I mean, that's bad news, but at least you're going to die probably well before you're 100 years old. But if you're one of these like post-singularity, super transhuman techno genies, motherfucker, you're going to live for 10,000 years. And now that 1% chance of any given year, you become the next Hitler. Well, things are so much worse because you've got the extra thousands of years.
Yeah, this is really worrying, man, and there's a theme in many a compelling sci-fi that the longer a being lives, just the more evil it tends to get, for various reasons. So that is a good point. Yep, don't know what to say about it, but it's a problem. the one thing I wanted to bring up, as long as we're on this topic before we move on to something else, is I'm more worried about, sorry if there's a bit of an abrupt, you can.
Oh, no, that's fine. You're doing great.
Oh, thanks, Pete.
It's
But
all been gold.
no, it's been fun. But so I think I'm more worried about, rather than like a killer AI or something evolving, I'm more worried about a super brain evolving in which we are neurons. From a human point of view, that worries me more than that there's something that's going to be actively hostile to us, is that there's something that's going to assimilate and overarch us, which already arguably is emerging or exists. So I was talking to a friend of mine the other day about how I was starting to feel that way. And he was like, yeah, I mean, it's not so bad being a neuron. You just sit around, you get a shot of chemicals once in a while, you produce some activity, a spike of activity, you get to relax for a little bit. But like, you know, neurons are these highly regimented beings, right? It's like we think of them in these architectural, like, you know, very engineering terms, but like, of course, they're just little dudes, right? And they've ended up forming this network because of the pressures on them in their environment. And I'm much more concerned that we're creating a system that subsumes individual humans as neuron-like things than that we're going to have robots that are. I also don't want to have to meet a killer robot in my lifetime ever, but you know.
So let me lay some science fiction on you and get your reaction to that. So one way of imagining the sort of thing that you're talking about, of us being neurons or being nodes in a larger network that is itself somehow on par with us, like it is the big mind, like we're a little mind. So like one version of that in science fiction is the singularity, right? That you get suddenly there's this technological explosion, you get some kind of super intelligent being that shows up on the scene, and not only is it really intelligent, but it's so weird, it's so much more different from us that we could barely understand what it's doing. Like a Terminator killer robot army, it's kind of easy to understand what it's doing. It's fucking killing us.
Right.
But here's another version of that. And this comes from a short story by the cyberpunk author, Bruce Sterling. And in this story, the people are, it's like, you know, a little bit in the future, people have like these mobile handheld devices that are networked, but you get these messages, and then like you'll get a text message from not a human. You suspect it's some kind of machine, and it will tell you something like, go buy a bouquet of flowers and stand in the corner of 34th and Broadway and give them to the first man that you see who's wearing glasses. So you go and you buy the flowers, you stand there looking around, someone you see a guy show up with glasses, you run up to him, you hand him the flowers. Just as that happens, a drone drops a beach ball in front of you, and there's a note written on the beach ball that says, now take this ball to this hospital with this little kid. So anyway, like these people are doing all these activities. The activities are causing other activities. No human is able to see what it all adds up to. But it's not obviously harmful.
Yeah.
What is it? Like, what is it? It would be like if like these, like if suddenly there were these driverless vehicles, and no one was sure what company made the driverless vehicles, and no one could tell what the driverless vehicles were transporting and why. It's just like some weird shit happening.
Yeah.
I mean, so things might go down like that, and then we might feel kind of uneasy. Like that might be a little bit weird. But anyway, this is all a setup for a question or a challenge. How different is that from what we're going through now? And by what we're going through now, I mean like in industrialism or capitalism or globalism. There's all these things that are bigger than individual human beings. No individual human being has a great handle on. I mean, there are people that have certain opinions about economics and politics, but like no one really knows how it all works, or why no one can really predict what it's going to be like tomorrow. So we're already a part of a thing. The only difference seems to be in the scenario you're worried about, the bigger thing is it's self-conscious, or it is it's self-minded. But modulo that, aren't we already in that situation? Like we're just cogs in this big machine. The machine is capitalism.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, no, 100%, man. No, that's the thing. That's the thing, is that it is already pretty much that way. And I think it does have its roots in industrialism. You know, it's not a new thing. It's like continuous with just working more and more hours per week, and, you know, valuing certain things over others, though, like valuing efficiency and STEM stuff more than anything else. You know, being really concerned with material well-being, which I understand. I am too. But you know, that all of it's just a tendency, it's a trajectory. But you're kind of right that that's a bit of a separate question from whether there's like a higher level organism or not. But it's those kinds of effects that we're already immersed in that I'm worried about. Like, I don't care if there's some, you know, weird super being that I'm a neuron in, if I have a good life, I guess. If I have a human life, I guess I'm attached to humanity somewhat. I'm not a transhumanist. I'll say that on this podcast. I'll admit that I'm not a transhumanist for various reasons.
I'm very conflicted about the question. Are you? Am I Pete Mandik a transhumanist? On paper, I want to be a transhumanist. It sounds like the sort of thing I'd be into. Spaceships and laser guns and jetpacks, and it's always appealed to me. But as I get old, and you know, I have children, and I worry about my children, and I worry about myself, and I'm really thinking about things about, like, well, what is the quality of life? What makes a life meaningful? What sorts of things are worse than death? When I think about those questions, I could easily imagine these hellscape, horrifying scenarios whereby the meaning is sucked out of life, and they're not necessarily killer robot scenarios. They might just like what happens if all our jobs are done by machines. Like, there's just nothing, even stuff that you thought was really creativity intensive or intelligence intensive, the things that you think of as like human, like the arts. What if machines could do all that? Like, a machine could teach you a class, a machine could give you a lecture, a machine could write a novel. What happens to those of us who aren't machines? What happens to our sense of the meaning and purpose of life? What's the value of our relationships? What the fuck are we going to do with our time?
Yeah.
We're just going to blast our consciousness with drugs, entertainments. So more and more I worry about that stuff. And when I get in that frame of mind, I tend towards like a neo-Luddism. Like, we just, like, the human industrial experiment is like obviously a failure. We're gonna be in hell if we don't go back to I don't know, buggies and horses.
Well, it's cool. I'm glad you worry about this too. But I haven't found a solution to this. Like, it's a real dilemma, because I don't think it could be that this is a dead end, right? Like, that we shouldn't have gone down this technology. We shouldn't have done this, and we just have to like go back. But also, all this amazing shit emerges out of this trajectory we've been on that never existed before, and that's valuable too. This novelty. I can't believe that. I'm not sure that that's just a mistake either. So I'm hoping that there's like a middle road here where, like, you know, like and the one thing that gives me comfort though is I don't think machines will get better at art than we are, better at like being an innovative like musician or something like that. There's really good shit out there like AI generated music, but I think it's always throwing some chaos into the mix is what makes it good.
I'm on that question. I'm inclined to think that they will be as good, and that's gonna change the way we value stuff. So, you know, here's a prediction. there will one day be machines that could write novels as good or better than humans, and humans just won't be interested in those novels so much. I mean, there's always going to be some weirdos. There's always some perverts that are right. They just want to fuck a machine. But so there might be someone who's like, no, I only read machine literature. But I think the general, again, this is a prediction. Of course, I could be wrong. But I think that if there are still people that we're going to value, like the way right now we value things that are handmade, even though you could get something that is machine made, and in some senses it's better. There's still differences, and people are able to value those differences. So they might, like, yeah, you could have this thing that's machine made and has all these extra features, but I want this simple homey thing that was knitted by a 5-year-old. And even though it kind of fucking sucks, I love it. I love it because of the flawed, organic human origin behind it. And so I'd rather read a novel that was written by an actual human being than a novel that is in some sense better, but there's no humanity behind it. Like it was written by someone who never took a shit. It was written by someone who's never really feared that their child was going to die. Even though in some sense it's like a better novel, it's got better chase scenes or more compelling romance scenes or something like that. I don't care. I want the one that came from the human, because I'm a human and I'm dedicated to the human project.
But that's exactly, I agree. I mean, I think that's exactly what I had in mind though, with like, yeah, the flaws in artworks relative to some genre ideal or something is what makes them interesting. So it's in the deeper version of that is, yeah, it's the human sort of flaws that make it interesting to other humans. But I guess the one scenario I can imagine is that, yeah, humans care about human created art. It's just that humanity itself is not really the center of the show anymore. It's like jazz or something, right? Like I love jazz, right? But it's not like there was a time when it was mainstream, right? And like you could, like, being the best jazz musician was being on the top of the world.
Yeah.
All the lights were on you. It was amazing. And now I still love jazz just as much, but it's not going to be the most interesting thing happening in the universe. So that could happen to humanity as such, right? And I would still love it. And it's like, it's either that, or, right? It's either humanity kind of fades away into its little, kind of hobby. It's like a hobby humanity's a hobby for humans, or we just keep developing and ramifying it, and like we have the best version of jazz and like all the stuff we've ever liked, and we just keep projecting it and expanding on it. But I don't know. It seems more likely that the way things go is the first thing to me, pessimistic as that is. I mean, whatever, right? Like I guess it's the question of whether sort of what makes us human, the human race is immortal as individuals are, or whether we can transmogrify that into like some thing that goes on forever. Fuck, I don't know.
By the way, a piece of science fiction that dwells in this area is that I love, highly recommend, is by the Polish science fiction author Stanislaw Lem, and it's this volume called Imaginary Magnitudes, and it's a collection of book reviews of non-existent books, but the books that are reviewed, they all kind of pivot or orbit around issues in artificial intelligence. So one of the books that's reviewed is about basically AI generated literature, and this was written, I think, in the 50s or 60s. It's funny how much of the stuff that's going on in the contemporary discussions mirrors the stuff Lem was doing. But anyways, in these artificial literature studies, they have these AI systems, and you could input to the system to generate novels in the style of Dostoevsky, or you could say, okay, write another Frank Herbert Dune story, and it could do these things. But then they could get even more fine grained than that, so they could come up with these models of literary development. So like, okay, there's early Hemingway, middle Hemingway, late Hemingway. And we could talk about what the parameters are that you would transform an early Hemingway into a late Hemingway. But then now that we've got those kinds of mechanisms, that kind of understanding, we could do all sorts of extrapolations and interpolations. So like, what if Hemingway lived for 40,000 years? Like, he didn't die. He's like, so like 40,000 years in the future, what would be, you know, so assuming like Hemingway keeps up his rate of production and he keeps changing in the directions he's been changing, what would the 40,000 years in the future? And then they go backwards too. So like, let's just forget the fact that Hemingway had a birthday and didn't exist, let alone write books prior to his birthday. Let's just take this model that allows us to extrapolate forward and back and now dial it back to like, what would a Hemingway novel from 1000 BC be like?
That's
right.
awesome.
Yeah. So there's just this weird literature of weird books about like, you know, what if you crossed whatever, these two authors and then crank the dial up to 40,000 years in the past, what would that literature be like? Yeah. But anyways, LaMDA is just great for generating these scenarios, and it's just so overwhelming. You read all these little examples, and it's just so weird. It's so deliciously weird. I highly recommend it. Imaginary Magnitudes by Stanislaw Lem. Can I guide us out of ethics and into something more nuts and boltsy?
Yeah, please, sure.
So let me ask you about the quest for AGI, artificial general intelligence. Some people are super skeptical that there could ever be such a thing. Other people think we're pretty close to it. Maybe we're just a decade or two away from it. Some people think there's very specific hurdles that have to be overcome. So what are your opinions about the feasibility of AGI? Do you think it's a long way off? It's pretty close. Are there any specific obstacles? Like, we have to solve the compositionality problem, and then most of the way there. What are your spicy takes about the nuts and bolts of the quest for AGI?
Yeah, thanks for asking. So what I think is that we're already, I sort of said as much in this recent tweet thread. I think that we're kind of already there. It's just that it's not that intelligent. So like, we have generality. We just don't have it's like we have a minuscule amount of general intelligence in systems like that Google Robot Butler. So I'm not saying that that's the holy grail, but there's no sharp distinction between the holy grail and what we have. And so that means that I don't think there's any specific challenge that we haven't solved, like compositionality, et cetera. I think vector space language models do what we need. There's a lot of evidence that like humans use things like that. There could be like deeper, more evolved structures that these models that we currently train on a bunch of linguistic data don't have. And I guess that's the thing that I think we're lacking. And I don't know how far away we are from that. It is just basically, well, like I think how the brain differs from like a big neural net language model is just that, it's got a lot of priors in the Bayesian sense, like built into its structure. And so there's no like specific thing. It's not like there might be like virtual machines, right, that are instantiated in neurons that are doing something that we haven't figured out how to program into neural nets yet. But I think most of that can be learned by sort of gradient descent over time. It's just, I think we just need a lot of time to do it. But a friend of mine, actually, I was just talking to Raphael Kaufman. I was debating this a bit on him with him on Twitter, and he pointed out this actually gave me pause. This is something I hadn't thought of, which is that evolution is like right? It's like you need to 100% do the things you have to do to survive. You can't just sort of approximate it statistically, right? And so the human brain has gone through all of these tests, right? This fitness test that's lasted for millions of years, and anything that survived had to 100% pass whatever the test is for reproduction. You can make it into more of a graded thing, by talking about how much reproduction there is.
Right.
So I don't think this is decisive, but the point is that is different from like just having to match a distribution like language models do is one thing, and then just having millions of years of iterated you know, natural selection or whatever kind of selection. You know, I think selection operates on all these levels, scales, neurons, phenotypes, all of that. But anyway, I feel like I'm meandering with respect to the question. It's just like AGI. I don't think we need any special magical ingredients. You know, like it's just, we probably need a whole lot of time. And it also depends on like how, like what we mean by general, like what would count as that, and like whether there's something really special about us. Like the last thing I'll say, the one thing that gives me pause here is that I kind of like Leibniz's idea that like organisms are machines that are machines in all their parts. So this goes back to the general sort of generalization of functionalism, where you say, well, the functions of neurons and quarks might matter. So I don't know if we can approximate that, right? I don't know. Like, again, we've emerged out of history, and the origins of history itself are really kind of unfathomable. So I don't know if we can, within history, if we can produce a thing that's got the requisite complexity or whatever the fuck the variable is. But shit, I don't know. I feel like, I guess I don't have any strong opinions on it, except it's not compositionality.
So let me ask you a slightly different question. And let me preface this by saying it's going to be very rambly. So if you're feeling bad about rambling, you're not alone. I'm gonna co-ramble with you. So anyway, so here's the rambly setup. Back when I was young, in grad school, in my 20s, it was often brought up as if it was an established fact that Chomsky defeated Skinner with a single blow from the vorpal blade of his poverty of the stimulus argument. He just cut his head right off with that awesome poverty of the stimulus argument. Now, people that know the actual history of Skinner and Chomsky know that it wasn't that simple, but as often the case, things are taught to you in this kind of like legendary mode, like, you know, behaviorism was defeated. The end. Anything that even resembles behaviorism has got to be garbage, because we all know that Noam came and just destroyed Skinner with that poverty of the stimulus argument. And there's a general kind of thinking that went along with that, at least, you know, when you're reading philosophers coming off of the East Coast in the 80s, the Fodor, Lepore kind of army, you get this feeling of like that what the behaviorists were trying to do, or the empiricists more generally, is just throw a whole bunch of learning at the problem, like just have it learn more stuff. And there was this feeling that was totally mistaken, that what you needed was a lot of intrinsic structure, maybe something as structured as like the language of thought, that you needed built into the hardware. You needed compositionality, systematicity. You need to build in that kind of stuff, that it couldn't simply be a whole bunch of learning. It had to be these very complicated innate structures. I get the impression, as a kind of a bystander, that the landscape has shifted greatly, that the successes of these models seem to vindicate that, like, kind of old school behaviorism, like methodological psychological behaviorism / empiricism, whereby, yeah, on the innate side of things, you just need a general learning mechanism, and then the rest is going to be in the data. Like, there you go. Just like it. And now our computers are big enough and fast enough that we can really just throw a bunch of data at it and see what happens. So anyway, the question is, do you think that it's correct to say that things have changed in that way, that like we used to think you couldn't do it with big data, and then now we've learned like there's a fuck ton that you could do with big data.
Yeah,
Lots of data, just throw a huge corpus.
yeah, I think that's pretty much right, except I'm not sure that what we're doing, humans, is exactly just the big data thing. But let me just say, the way my perspective on this has shifted in the last 10 years. So I used to think that innate versus learned was a big deal. Now I think it's just how much is model selection over the course of evolution versus parameter tuning over the course of a lifetime. So it doesn't feel like a big deal anymore. It is a big deal still, right? Because if you want to build a system that does X, you have to like, it's not so easy to just run evolution for a million years, right? But like, there's not a big difference in kind. It's all learning, right? It's learning either at the time scale of an individual or a lifetime, or at the time scale of the phenotype, right, or evolution or something. But like, I think the landscape's totally shifted. Like poverty of the stimulus, this ties back to the unsupervised learning stuff we were talking about at the beginning, right? So like what Jeff Hinton pointed out, who's like, for my money, he's like the guy in machine learning, but he pointed out that if you use the sensory signal, which is incredibly rich in information, as a learning signal to like learn all this structure, then you can do a lot just with that signal. And Chomsky said the signal's impoverished, and I think there was a lot of evidence that it just isn't, right? It's in the higher order statistics of the inputs. I've had a lot of arguments with linguists about this stuff. I think you can point to specific ways in which vector spaces learn the kinds of structures you'd need. But that doesn't mean, I guess, that, right, that like systems like LaMDA are doing the thing we're doing, because maybe you need a million years to learn exactly that, right? But I mean, it's pretty damn good. And it's hard for me to believe that there's a big qualitative difference between what we're doing and something like that. It's like maybe a little bit better. But the one further caveat is, like I think there's a lot of evidence. I'm not going to quite articulate this exactly precisely, but evidence that the brain isn't really doing big data. It's more like small data. So like in the sense that there's, I'm not going to be able to quantify this right now, but basically there are more synapses to train than there are like meaningful moments of experience on which to train the thing. Yeah. So the model really does matter in a way that like probably the performance we're getting out of the best performing machine learning systems, like which have like trillions of parameters, that's probably not quite how the brain's doing it. Like we probably have something more built in, but it would have been something that was learned over the course of evolution.
By the way, there's a really cute Paul Churchland argument from several years back, which I think of as kind of it's kind of like the reverse of the Chomsky poverty of the stimulus argument. I don't remember what Churchland calls it, but I would call it the poverty of the genome argument. So Churchland is arguing against this general kind of Chomsky Fodor view that if you think information theoretically in terms of like, okay, what's on the biggest estimate you could come up with for the genome, how many bits of information can be stored in the genome? And then now let's think about the human brain in terms of its synapses. You could come up with a calculation that would tell you, given how many synapses there are, how many bits of information you would need to specify those synapses to have. So like here, could you, given the memory capacity of the genome and the memory demands of a brain that's able to speak a language, could that be innate? Could you, in theory, have someone who is born able to speak English because somehow all the information about what the synapses would need to be set to is stored in the genome, and the rest of the argument from there is just math. It's just arithmetic, actually. Like, and the answer is no. There's nowhere near enough fucking information in the genome to, even assuming like you're using the whole genome just for the brain, it's not enough. There's way more synapses. than that.
Great. Great.
Anyway, it's a fun, super fun argument. I love Paul Churchland papers. They often have some cool technical thing that's like that. In our time remaining, I wanted to sneak in a question, one more super half-baked or maybe even a quarter-baked question. It's kind of like the one I was just asking you about the poverty stimulus, but this is more meta-philosophical.
Cool.
Because one thing I wonder about when I think about this stuff is how much this tells us about the way we should be conducting ourselves as philosophers. By which I mean, you know, a lot of analytic philosophers, they seem to act like what concepts are is like a list of necessary and sufficient conditions. So if you look at the methods, when people are like coming up with, you know, biconditionals, S knows that P if and only if S ate a banana on Wednesday, the presupposition seems to be like you're analyzing a concept, and what it is to analyze a concept is to attempt to discover what the necessary and sufficient conditions are for being alive, or the necessary and sufficient conditions for having propositional knowledge or whatever. But as people have been saying to each other for decades, probably that's not the way concepts work. And that has some real ramifications that even like, you know, Wittgenstein is trying to deal with this. If concepts aren't definitions, if they're more like family resemblances, then, well, now how do you do philosophy? What do you do given that there's no such thing as like the true analysis or the correct definition? And so I wonder, like, if our spicy takes from before the break are correct, and that what we are doing is what LaMDA is already able to do, then what does that tell us about, for example, concepts or thinking? Like, what should we be doing if we're going to keep doing philosophy? Like, what lessons are there at the meta-philosophical level? The thing about the poverty stimulus, the thing about like, does that have moral status? Those are all first order philosophical questions. But now there's this second order philosophical question, which is like, well, what the fuck is philosophy? How do you do it well? Right? Is it trying to find the necessary and sufficient conditions for being alive?
Yeah.
Maybe not, if concepts don't resolve into lists of necessary and sufficient conditions. If knowing a concept is something like, oh, do you know about Crungus, or do you know about this thing? Gorgas. There's this, oh God, it's so cool. This is a meme that has emerged from all this LaMDA, DALL-E type stuff. So someone made up a word, like Crungus, or like they just made up a word. Maybe it's Crungus. Yeah, I think that's it. Grungus. They typed in Crungus to, I think, DALL-E Mini.
Yeah.
And DALL-E Mini kicked back this like troll, a bunch of images of this troll that's got big tusks and long hair, and the images are very similar to each other. And so like this got shared on Twitter or something, it went viral, and lots of other people who have, you know, lots of people have access now to DALL-E Mini, and you could experiment that yourself. They would type in like Crungus skateboarding, or Crungus eating a hoagie, or Crungus dancing the Macarena, and it's fucking Crungus. It's this green troll creature. And then, you know, people have tested some hypotheses about what the fuck is going on here. So they would make up other names that sound kind of like Crungus and see what happens. So someone like typed in Pringus. There's a made up word that might be a monster's name. Well, Pringus turned out just to be just like stained glass windows or flowers or something like that. It wasn't a monster. So there's this new cryptid, the Crungus, which has emerged from these big language models. Anyway, so one of the things, besides just being intrinsically fucking cool, Crungus, it made me wonder, like, how many of our, like, is this a way of thinking about concepts? Like we have like, in philosophy, we have these wacky concepts, like someone starts talking about qualia. That's like a technical word, kind of, right? Like that's not normal English, qualia. That's some bullshit that I think originates with C.S. Peirce. He introduces the term, and then it gets picked up by C.S. Lewis a little bit later, and then it kind of like starts to gel into something kind of like the meaning that we use today. But here's the thing. It's not a real technical term like in math where someone introduces a term and then gives you an explicit definition and then they fucking stick with it. It's like one of these bullshitty fake pseudo technical words that no one like gets introduced, but no one really fully defines it. And then people like start trying to do conceptual analysis on it and publish papers about like, could the whole universe have qualia? Could a robot have qualia without ever defining what qualia are? But maybe on this new view of what concepts are the sorts of things like, for example, Crungus. They could just be these weird emergent, like they don't have to, there doesn't have to ever be a definition of Crungus.
Yeah.
Crungus wasn't in the corpus, but somehow what was in the corpus, like something about words that start with CR and words that end with OUS and all these different things like gave rise to this emergent concept or this category, which maybe doesn't have a real word referent. There is no Crungus. There's no Crungus among us, but nonetheless, we somehow have this concept. Anyway, this just made me wonder how many of our concepts are kind of like that. Maybe qualia are like that. Maybe qualia is a Crungus concept. Or maybe some really big, important concepts like truth or goodness or beauty are Crungus concepts.
No way, not those.
And now what? As philosophers, people trained to sit on their asses and just stroke their beards and think about shit. If that's the way thought works, if we've got a head full of Crungi, now what? What lessons, if any, does that have for the conduct of loving wisdom?
Well, one thing that you just made me realize is we shouldn't do conceptual analysis on technical terms in philosophy, because I agree that that's probably the source of a lot of waste.
Oh yeah.
I think, but like, I think there's a notion of concept that survives here, which is actually the one that I swear I cited you, like you wrote a paper about the Churchland's notion of concepts as attractors. And I think that pretty much survives intact to like the newer neural network models. They're minima in a giant energy landscape that's created by all these simultaneous constraints, including ones coming in from vision and proprioception shit. So that, and what survives there is these attractors are discrete things, even though it's in a continuous space, they behave as discrete entities, right? And a lot of them can get created, right? You're creating this whole landscape in virtue of trying to parse these inputs, and you probably create lots of features that you weren't intending to create or that weren't explicitly in the corpus. So like that's there, man. I think concepts are still there. To me, the weakest link is philosophy as conceptual analysis. But again, like maybe we should focus on, you know, fundamental concepts that have stood the test of time. Like, okay, I think truth, beauty, even just like car, shit like that is like more likely to have something to it in terms of being a stable attractor across people than like qualia. But I think we should just be really selective about the concepts we analyze. But that's fascinating, man. I did not know about that whole thread. That's the first thing I'm gonna do after this call is is look into that, because that's
Google Crungus, man. Crungus is awesome.
It's everything I've ever wanted out of neural net like art. You know, it's amazing.
Oh, here's another thing that you might like. There's a group project of people interested in psychedelic art. So art that's explicitly done under the influence of various psychedelic drugs, or is explicitly done it's with the, you know, inspiration from that. So maybe you're not high while you make the art, but you know what it's like, you did it once before or something like that. So anyways, this group of people have, and I'll find this and link it to the show notes, they have created this huge database of human generated psychedelic artwork. And then they might have done some more to the curation process. I don't know if they're tagging it in certain ways or what, but this huge database of human generated psychedelic art. And then they train one of these like big data things on it. and it generates its own psychedelic art, right? But unlike, say, for example, like say Google Deep Dream, when that came out, what, 7 years ago or something like that, that wasn't trained on psychedelic art, but its outputs look very like, if you've done acid, you would agree, like, oh, you've seen some of this stuff before. Like it's really locking onto something, at least seemingly, that's similar to our own perceptual systems when we're on DMT or LSD or something like that. But this project, the training is itself psychedelic. And I think there might be maybe some tags also, but I'm not sure about that. Like they're tagging it as like, this is more Salvia divinorum art, this is more DMT art, this is, I don't know. But I'll link to that. It's very cool. Not as cool as Crungus. Crungus is really, I don't know why Crungus is really exciting. And somebody needs to be making a horror movie about this stuff right now. Like if they haven't already got film rights on Crungus, the DALL-E murders, the Black DALL-E, something. There's got to be money to be made from this as a subgenre of horror. But anyway, I'm rambling now.
No, I
Hail Crungus.
I knew Crungus when you said it. I knew Crungus was like a weird trolly monster thing, right? So it's not like there's and whereas Pringus, I'm like, Pringus?
Yeah, Pringus drives a Prius, can't be that bad. But Crungus like maybe hangs out with Krampus, maybe knows about Big Chungus, who's a little eerie, although probably harmless. Crungus definitely, is kind of like maybe some Freddy Krueger is getting in there. Crungus.
Oh. Yeah.
This is we should wrap it up because I was originally planning to be out by 12:30. There's a whole bunch of stuff I would love to talk to you about. Maybe you could come back and talk about the free energy principle. Don't you know stuff about the free energy principle? And
yeah, it's all related to this stuff intimately. Yeah, I'd love to.
Because that's another thing that I just feel super ignorant about. Like if someone said, Mandik, can you lecture tomorrow about what the free energy principle is? I would say, nope, no. Like, I have no idea.
To be fair, it's not the clearest thing to pin down, but yeah.
But this has been a very super cool and fun conversation, and really clarifying and helpful, at least for me. I suspect the audience will dig it also.
Well, I hope so. It's a lot of fun for me, and I love exploring this stuff. It's Crungus especially. I mean, and there's just, I'm frustrated sometimes. I can't articulate things. I feel like I know what I want to say, but it's very difficult to serialize into language. But
yeah, well, that's the great thing about this medium. It's not a conference presentation, it's not a classroom lecture, but it's not just me and you shooting the shit at the bar. There's a little bit of that extra pressure because it's being recorded for an audience. So it's very interesting. I find the whole process of thinking out loud in a podcast conversation is really helpful and productive. And it also helps if there's cool people such as Alex Kiefer involved. I really enjoy talking to you about this stuff. I'm going to push the button. Please stay on so we could talk outside of the recording.
Yeah. Thanks.
But while I'm still recording, let me just once again say thank you very much, Alex. And I look forward to having you back on to talk more about all that other stuff, free energy principle, Bayesianism, the predictive brain,
cool,
so on and so forth.
Yeah.
All right. Thank you very much. Here we go. I'm pushing the button.